Here is something that might stop you mid-breath. Researchers have calculated that the single greatest predictor of heart disease, depression, addiction, and early death in adulthood, the variable that outpaces smoking, diet, and genetics in predictive power, is not anything that happens to you as an adult. It's what happened to you before you were 10 years old. That finding didn't come from a psychology lab. It came from a weight loss clinic. And the doctor who discovered it was nearly laughed out of his profession for it. We'll get there. But first, take a slow breath in. Let your shoulders settle. Feel the weight of the surface beneath you, the quiet of this particular hour. Tonight, we're moving through something that doesn't live in textbooks. Not really. It lives in the pause before someone answers when you ask if they're okay. It lives in the body's strange, faithful loyalty to a past it was never given the chance to understand. We are going to talk about childhood trauma, what it actually is, what it does inside the brain and nervous system, how it quietly orchestrates patterns in our adult relationships, and what decades of careful research tell us about the road through it. This is not a frightening conversation. I promise you that. It is, if anything, one of the most clarifying conversations in modern psychology. Because once you understand the mechanism, so many things about human behavior, including perhaps your own, begin to make a quiet, compassionate sense. You are safe here. We begin. Before we can understand what childhood trauma does to us, we need to spend a little time with what it actually is. Because the word itself has been stretched in public discourse, sometimes used too narrowly, sometimes applied so broadly it loses meaning, and the science deserves precision. In clinical psychology, trauma refers to an experience, or a series of experiences, that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope, leaving behind a disruption in how the nervous system processes threat, memory, and safety. The 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders defines trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. That definition captures acute, catastrophic events, a car crash, a violent assault, a disaster. But clinicians who work specifically with children have long argued that this framing is too narrow. It catches the dramatic events and misses the quieter, more pervasive adversities that, in many ways, prove equally, and sometimes more, damaging to the developing mind. The broader clinical understanding, used in trauma research and now in public health, recognizes several categories of childhood adversity. Physical abuse, the deliberate infliction of harm. Sexual abuse, emotional abuse, the persistent pattern of belittling, threatening, shaming, or rejecting a child in ways that erode their sense of self and worth. Physical neglect, the failure to provide basic needs like food, warmth, medical care, and shelter. And emotional neglect, perhaps the most invisible of all categories, which is the chronic failure to respond to a child's emotional and psychological needs. Not seeing them, not attuning to them, not letting them know in consistent and believable ways that they are loved. Beyond direct harm, there are what researchers call the household dysfunction experiences, witnessing domestic violence in the home, growing up with a parent who struggles with addiction or untreated mental illness, having a family member incarcerated, losing a parent to divorce or separation. These experiences don't harm the child's body directly, but they shape the environment of safety, predictability, and emotional availability that a developing child needs like oxygen. Here's what makes childhood uniquely vulnerable, and this is something that took medicine a long time to fully appreciate. The first years of life are not simply a formative period in some soft, metaphorical sense. They are a period of extraordinary neurological construction. More than 1 million new neural connections form every second in the first year of life. The architecture of the brain is being built in real time by experience. The environments we grow up in don't just influence us. On a cellular and structural level, they build us, which means that the experiences of childhood, particularly the repeated chronic ones, are not merely memories. They are biological events. And understanding that single sentence changes everything about how we look at what follows. If there is one discovery that transformed our understanding of childhood adversity's reach, it is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs study, and it began, of all places, in an obesity clinic. In the mid-1980s, a physician named Vincent Felitti was running a weight management program at the Kaiser Permanente Department of Preventive Medicine in San Diego, California. The program was producing real results. Patients were losing significant weight, and then, in a pattern that baffled the clinical team, they kept dropping out. Not because the program wasn't working, because it was. The weight was coming off. And when it did, something else began to come up. Felitti began sitting with the patients who left, asking careful, open questions. And what emerged, again and again, were histories of childhood, of abuse, of loss, of households that had not been safe. One woman told him, with disarming clarity, that she had gained over 100 pounds in the year following a sexual assault in her early 20s, and that the weight had felt, in some wordless, bodily way, like protection. As it began to leave, she felt exposed, and so she left. Felitti presented these early findings in 1990 at the North American Association for the Study of Obesity in Atlanta. The response was not what he had hoped for. The experts gathered there suggested, largely, that his patients were lying to him, that the histories were fabricated, that the connection he was drawing was not real. This is the first twist in the story, because Felitti didn't retreat. He took that professional dismissal and used it to find a collaborator at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a medical epidemiologist named Robert Anda, who recognized that what Felitti had observed needed rigorous, large-scale testing. Together, between 1995 and 1997, they surveyed 17,421 adult patients at Kaiser Permanente San Diego, asking them, confidentially, about 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences before the age of 18. 3 categories of abuse: physical, emotional, and sexual. 2 categories of neglect: physical and emotional. And 5 categories of household dysfunction: growing up with a parent who abused substances, living with a family member with mental illness, having a family member who was incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence, and experiencing parental separation or divorce. Each category counted as 1 point. A score of 0 meant no adverse experiences reported. A score of 4 or more was considered high. The findings, published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine in 1998, were what Anda later described as devastating. More than half of participants, in this population of predominantly white, middle-class, insured adults, reported at least one adverse childhood experience. 1 in 4 reported 2 or more. And here is where it becomes extraordinary. Those with an ACE score of 4 or higher, compared to those with a score of 0, showed a 4 to 12-fold increased risk of serious health problems, including alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, and suicide attempts. The likelihood of a suicide attempt was found to be roughly 12 times higher in those with the highest ACE scores, and more than 2/3 of all suicide attempts among the top. Study population could be attributed, statistically, to childhood adversity. The relationship between ACE score and chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, skeletal fractures, liver disease, was consistent and graded. The more adverse experiences, the steeper the climb. Here's the reveal that no one in mainstream medicine was ready for. These were not fringe individuals with extreme histories. These were regular patients, the kind who come in for standard checkups, whose charts listed diabetes and heart disease and chronic pain, with no mention anywhere of what had shaped their nervous systems decades before. Medicine had been treating the symptoms for generations while missing, almost entirely, the root. Subsequent population surveys across the United States, using the CDC's Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System and covering all 50 states, have found that approximately 2 in 3 American adults report at least one adverse childhood experience, and about 1 in 6 report 4 or more. The ACES study did not describe a vulnerable minority. It described the majority of the human population. If the ACES study showed us the what, the neuroscience of childhood trauma has been steadily revealing the how. And what it shows is both unsettling and, in a profound way, clarifying. The human brain develops from the bottom up and inside out. The oldest, deepest structures, the brainstem, which governs basic survival functions like heart rate and breathing, develop first. Above it sits the limbic system, governing emotion, memory, attachment, and threat detection. And resting on top, the last to fully mature, developing well into our mid-20s, is the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, impulse control, empathy, and long-term planning. In a consistent, nurturing environment, these systems develop in coordination. The stress response activates when needed and quiets when the threat passes. The child learns through thousands of repetitions of being frightened and then soothed that distress is survivable, that comfort comes, that the world is, broadly, predictable. In a chronically unsafe or unpredictable environment, this system is shaped differently. Dr. Bruce Perry, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist whose decades of work with traumatized children produced the foundational text, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, describes the brain as a use-dependent organ. The systems that are activated most frequently become the most robust. In an environment of chronic threat, the threat detection and survival systems activate repeatedly, and they strengthen. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, becomes sensitized. It learns to fire sooner and with less provocation. It becomes, in effect, a hair trigger. Meanwhile, the hippocampus, which plays a central role in turning off the stress response once danger has passed, is often found to be reduced in volume in individuals with histories of early trauma. This gives us something worth sitting with. The brake on the stress response is physically smaller. The alarm is not just more easily triggered, it is harder to turn off. Dr. Martin Teicher, a researcher at Harvard Medical School, published important work in 2002, including a widely read piece in Scientific American, showing that childhood maltreatment produces measurable changes in brain structure and function that can be understood as adaptations. That is a careful word, and it is the right one. These changes were not random damage. They were the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, become what its environment required it to become. Here is where a kind of quiet justice enters the picture. The brain of a child who grew up in an unsafe environment likely became hypervigilant, reactive, and primed for threat, because that was the appropriate response to that environment. The problem is that when the environment changes, when the child grows up, leaves, builds a new life, the brain's operating system often doesn't update. It keeps running the old software. And what was once a survival advantage becomes a source of suffering in a world that is, for the most part, no longer the same threat it was. Researchers have also noted changes in the corpus callosum, the band of fiber connecting the brain's 2 hemispheres, which appears smaller in some individuals with early trauma histories. What this might mean for how the thinking and feeling sides of the brain communicate is still being studied, but it's thought to relate, at least in part, to the dissociative experiences, the sense of being cut off from one's own feelings, or watching one's life from a slight distance, that many trauma survivors describe. Based on what we know about how interhemispheric communication supports emotional integration, a reduction in this connection could, at minimum, make it harder to bring feelings and reasoning into coherent conversation with each other. The HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs the release of cortisol and other stress hormones, is also consistently found to be dysregulated in individuals with early trauma histories. In some people, it becomes chronically overactivated, flooding the body with stress hormones in response to relatively minor triggers. In others, following overwhelming and inescapable stress, it shifts into a kind of blunted, under-responsive mode, a shutdown that reduces overwhelm at the cost of a flattened, muted experience of the world. Both adaptations make perfect sense in light of what the nervous system was managing. Neither is comfortable to live with as an adult. To understand childhood trauma fully, we need to step into the world of attachment theory, because it is within our earliest relationships that so much of trauma's most lasting work unfolds. Attachment theory was developed by British psychiatrist John Seychelles. Bowlby, whose first major works appeared in the 1950s and extended through decades of clinical observation and writing. Bowlby's central argument was elegant and radical for its time. Human infants are biologically programmed to seek closeness, not primarily for food, as earlier theories had assumed, but for safety. The attachment system, in Bowlby's framework, is an evolved biological mechanism whose function is to keep vulnerable young organisms close to a protective adult, especially when those organisms perceive threat. When the attachment system activates, triggered by fear, pain, illness, or any sense of danger, the infant signals distress, crying, reaching, calling out. If a consistent, attuned caregiver responds with comfort and reassurance, the infant gradually develops what Bowlby called an internal working model, a template constructed through thousands of repeated experiences of how the world works, how relationships go, and what to expect when you need help. A child whose signals are reliably answered builds a model that says, the world is generally safe, others are trustworthy, and I am worthy of care. A child whose signals are inconsistently or inadequately answered builds something more complicated. In the 1970s, developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth expanded Bowlby's work through a now famous series of structured observations called the strange situation. By briefly separating infants from their caregivers and watching their reactions upon reunion, she identified distinct patterns of attachment: secure, anxious ambivalent, and avoidant. In 1986, researchers Mary Main and Judith Solomon identified a fourth pattern, and it is the one most closely tied to trauma: disorganized attachment. It occurs when the caregiver, who is supposed to be the source of safety, is also, somehow, a source of fear. This places the infant in an impossible bind: the system that says approach the caregiver for safety, and the system that says flee from danger are activated simultaneously toward the same person. The result is a collapse of any coherent strategy. Infants with disorganized attachment display contradictory, chaotic behavior, simultaneously reaching out and pulling back, freezing mid-movement, appearing momentarily dissociated. And here is perhaps the most quietly important thing to understand about all of this. The internal working models built in infancy don't retire when we grow up. They go with us. They shape who we are drawn to, how we handle conflict, whether we can tolerate closeness, how we feel about ourselves when we are alone, and what we do when someone we love disappoints us. They operate largely below conscious awareness, not as beliefs we can examine and revise, but as reflexes, as the emotional weather we wake up inside of each morning, without choosing it. This is not fatalism, but it is honesty about the depth of the work. There is a layer of the trauma story that exists, below even psychology, in the body itself, in the autonomic nervous system, in the wordless, biological grammar of safety and danger. And two to the vagus nerve, a long branching to the vagus nerve. A long branching nerve that runs from the brainstem through the face, throat, heart, lungs, and gut, and plays a central role in regulating the body's states. Porges proposed that the autonomic nervous system is organized into 3 hierarchical states, each associated with different behavioral and physiological responses. The first and most evolutionarily recent is what Porges calls the ventral vagal state, a state of social engagement and calm. When we are here, the face is open and expressive. The voice carries natural warmth and variation. We can make and hold eye contact comfortably. We can listen deeply. Learning, intimacy, play, and creativity are all most available to us from within this state. It is, to use a simple word, the feeling of being safe. The second state is sympathetic activation, mobilization. When the nervous system detects threat, it shifts into fight or flight. The heart rate climbs, muscles prepare for action, digestion slows, the field of attention narrows. This is a brilliantly designed biological emergency system. In a genuine threat, it can save a life. The third state is the most ancient. Dorsal vagal shutdown, immobilization. When threat is perceived as overwhelming and inescapable, the nervous system may drop into this state. Heart rate drops, muscle tone softens, consciousness narrows or dissociates. This is the freeze response, the collapse, the going away that can feel like profound numbness, disconnection, or a sense of not quite being present in one's own body. Here's the key insight for childhood trauma. The nervous system learns. It adapts. And in an environment of chronic early adversity, it learns to spend more time in the threat states, because that is what safety required. It becomes calibrated to a world where danger is always possible and recovery windows are short. Even when the original environment is long gone, the nervous system continues to scan. It pattern matches current experiences against stored templates of threat. A tone of voice, a specific silence, the way someone's posture shifts in a moment of tension. Any of these might trigger a cascade in the nervous system that seems, to the rational mind, completely disproportionate to what's actually happening. Because the nervous system isn't responding to what's happening. It's responding to what this resembles. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose 2014 book, The Body Keeps the Score, brought these ideas to a wide audience and became one of the most widely read books in the history of trauma psychology. Spent decades documenting how trauma is encoded, not only in declarative memory, the kind we can narrate, but in the body's posture, its reflexes, its physiological rhythms. Survivors describe the racing heart at a particular tone of voice, the chest tightening when someone is angry in the next room, the inexplicable urge to go very still and very small when conflict is close. These are not character flaws. They are not weakness. They are the faithful, predictable responses of a nervous system that learned, in a formative window, that survival required this level of readiness. Understanding that, really understanding it, is the shift from what is wrong with me to what happened to me, and what did my body do to survive it. That shift is not merely semantic. For many people, it is the beginning of something real. When most people think of post-traumatic stress, they picture a single catastrophic event followed by flashbacks and nightmares. That is a real and serious presentation. But for those whose trauma began in childhood and was sustained over months or years, often within the family itself, what tends to emerge is something broader and more pervasive than standard PTSD can quite capture. Psychiatrist and trauma researcher Judith Herman, whose 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery, remains one of the foundational texts in the field, proposed a distinct clinical picture to describe the aftermath of prolonged, repeated interpersonal trauma. particularly when it begins early in life. She called it complex PTSD, or CPTSD. Herman observed that survivors of chronic trauma showed a constellation of symptoms beyond the standard re-experiencing, avoidance, and hyperarousal of classic PTSD. They showed profound disturbances in how they saw themselves, difficulties managing emotional intensity, deeply held shame and guilt, and pervasive struggles in intimate relationships. In 2018, the World Health Organization formally recognized complex PTSD as a distinct diagnosis in the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, the SOLD ICD-11. It describes CPTSD as including all the features of standard PTSD, plus 3 additional dimensions. Affect dysregulation, meaning intense emotions that are difficult to manage. Negative self-concept, meaning a persistent sense of being damaged, worthless, or different from other people. And disturbances in relationships, including difficulty trusting, difficulty feeling close to others, and difficulty sustaining connections. Psychotherapist Pete Walker, who has written openly about his own experience of a traumatic childhood, and whose work on CPTSD has helped many readers recognize themselves in clinical language for the first time, described what he calls the 4 survival responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The first 3 are familiar. The 4th is quieter and perhaps more common than we realize. Fawning describes a pattern in which a person learns, through repeated experience, that the safest way to manage a threatening relationship is to be pleasing, to agree, to become whatever the threatening person seems to need. It emerges in children who grew up in environments where a caregiver's moods were unpredictable, where reading the room accurately and adjusting accordingly was the only available strategy for preventing an escalation. The child who fawns becomes exquisitely attuned to others' emotional states. They develop remarkable sensitivity to the subtle shifts in tone or expression that signal displeasure, and they learn to suppress their own needs, preferences, and feelings in order to manage the external world. In adulthood, this pattern, no longer needed for the original purpose, can surface as persistent people-pleasing, an inability to identify what one actually wants, a profound discomfort with conflict, and a tendency to feel most comfortable in caretaking roles while struggling to be cared for in return. These people are often described by others as remarkably empathetic and selfless. They often feel hollow inside. The critical reframe that both Herman's work and Walker's offer is this: the symptoms of CPTSD are not pathological in isolation. They are logical outcomes of environments that required exactly these adaptations. They were the solutions. The difficulty is that the problems they solved are gone, while the solutions themselves remain, often quietly undermining the life the person is trying to build. Here is the finding that stopped scientists in their tracks, because it suggested that the effects of childhood trauma may not end with the person who experienced it. They may be carried, in part, into the next generation, not only through behavior and parenting patterns, but potentially through the biology of the cell. This is the emerging field of epigenetics, and its implications for how we understand trauma are extraordinary and still being carefully examined. To understand what epigenetics means, a brief image is helpful. Our DNA contains the full set of instructions for building and operating the body. But not all of those instructions are active at all times. Epigenetics refers to chemical modifications. Think of them as annotations that sit on or near the DNA and regulate whether particular genes are expressed or silenced. These annotations can be influenced by environmental experience, including stress and adversity. And some of them, evidence suggests, may be heritable. Much of the early research came from animal models. Michael Meany and his colleagues at McGill University conducted important work showing that the quality of maternal care rats provided to their pups, specifically the amount of licking and grooming, produced measurable epigenetic differences in the stress response systems of the offspring. Pups who received attentive care developed more flexible stress regulation. Those who received less attentive care showed more reactive stress responses, and these differences persisted into adulthood. Based on what these animal studies consistently showed, many researchers began to suspect that similar processes might operate in humans. Then, in 2016, Rachel Yehuda and her colleagues at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai published a study examining Holocaust survivors and their adult children. They looked specifically at a stress regulation gene called FKBP5, a gene involved in the body's ability to modulate its cortisol response. What they found was that both Holocaust survivors and their adult offspring showed epigenetic changes at the same site within this gene, though in opposite directions, suggesting a complex biological response rather than a simple copy. The study was small, 32 survivors and 22 of their adult children, and scientists appropriately emphasize that it should be understood as a significant but preliminary finding, not a definitive conclusion. The sample size limits what can be confidently generalized, but the finding was remarkable enough to be the first demonstration, in humans, of an association between parental trauma that occurred before conception and epigenetic changes visible in the next generation. What this could imply, and researchers say this carefully, is that the biological consequences of severe and prolonged trauma may not be contained within a single lifetime. They may leave a kind of molecular signature that influences how the next generation's stress systems are calibrated, even before that generation experiences the world for themselves. This is not a counsel of despair. Epigenetic changes, unlike DNA mutations, are potentially reversible. And even where biological vulnerability exists, it unfolds in interaction with experience, including healing experiences. What seems most likely, based on the accumulating evidence, is that intergenerational trauma involves multiple overlapping channels: epigenetic, behavioral, relational, and cultural. A parent who has never processed their own trauma will unconsciously create an emotional environment that reflects it. A nervous system that was itself formed in an atmosphere of fear may, without any intention to harm, transmit something of that atmosphere to the next generation, through the micro interactions of everyday life, through what is said and what is not, through the quality of attention that is available, and the quality that is withheld. Recognizing this cycle with compassion, not with blame, is essential. The parent who was never taught to soothe distress cannot teach what they were never given. And understanding where these patterns began is the beginning of ending them. We've spent time in the science. Now let's come a little closer to the ground, to what it actually looks like to carry the effects of early trauma into adult life. Because for many people, the connection between a difficult childhood and the texture of their adult experience is not obvious. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up instead in patterns. It shows up in the person who can't sleep without scanning the house one more time, in the one who finds intimacy terrifying even with someone they love, in the high achiever who lives in constant dread of being revealed as inadequate, in the individual who consistently finds themselves in relationships that, in some structural way, replicate the dynamics of their family of origin, and cannot understand why. Research has consistently documented these connections. A 2012 meta-analysis drawing on the WHO World Mental Health Surveys, examining data across 21 countries and tens of thousands of individuals, found that childhood adversity was associated with significantly elevated rates of depression, anxiety, conduct disorders, substance use, and psychotic illness in adulthood. Across analyses, childhood adversity has been estimated to account for a substantial proportion of all adult psychiatric disorders, with some researchers placing the figure at roughly 1/3. The body carries it too. Beyond the elevated rates of chronic disease documented in the original ACES study, research has found higher rates of chronic pain, autoimmune conditions, gastrointestinal disorders, and migraine among individuals with trauma histories. The term somatization, the expression of psychological distress through physical symptoms, is remarkably common in this population. Based on what we know about how chronic stress affects the immune, endocrine, and inflammatory systems, this is not surprising. The body was never separate from the mind. It kept the score all along. One of the most pervasive and underappreciated legacies of childhood trauma is shame. Not guilt, which is the feeling that one has done something wrong, but shame, which is the feeling that one is something wrong. Researcher Brené Brown, whose work on vulnerability and shame has reached millions of readers, describes shame as the intensely painful belief that one is fundamentally flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And developmental psychologist Dan Siegel has described what happens when children are repeatedly shamed, either through direct humiliation or through the more subtle shaming of consistent neglect, emotional unavailability, or conditional love. The child makes themselves the cause, rather than concluding that something is wrong with what is happening to them, a conclusion that would require acknowledging that the caregivers they depend on are failing. They conclude that something is wrong with them. This is a protective shift. A child who is the problem is a child who, theoretically, can fix things. A child with a failing caregiver is helpless. So the shame is chosen, unconsciously, faithfully chosen. And it rides all the way into adulthood, where it whispers that the difficulties one faces are somehow deserved. Evidence, not of what was done to one, but of who one fundamentally is. Recognizing shame for what it is, not a verdict but a strategy, and an outdated one, is one of the most liberating moves available to someone walking the path toward healing. Perhaps the most important thing to hold as we near the end of tonight's exploration is this: what experience has shaped, experience can, in significant measure, also transform. The same science that reveals how early adversity alters the brain also reveals the brain's neuroplasticity. Its lifelong capacity to form new connections, revise its operating patterns, and reorganize in response to new experience. Healing from childhood trauma is not linear. It does not happen on a schedule. It does not look the same for everyone, but it is real, documented, researched, and witnessed in the lives of countless people who have moved through their histories and found something different on the other side. Trauma-informed care has emerged over the past 2 decades as a framework for understanding and responding to the impact of trauma across systems, healthcare, education, social services, and beyond. At its center is a deceptively simple shift, from asking what is wrong with you to asking what happened to you. That shift, from pathology to experience, changes everything. The questions a clinician asks, the way an educator understands a struggling student, the lens through which a social worker reads a family's story. Several psychotherapeutic approaches have demonstrated meaningful effectiveness for trauma survivors through clinical research. Eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, was developed in 1987 by psychologist Francine Shapiro. It involves recalling traumatic memories while engaging in bilateral stimulation, typically guided eye movements, and is thought to facilitate the reprocessing of those memories so that they lose their overwhelming charge and can be integrated into ordinary autobiographical narrative rather than remaining as isolated, sensory-charged intrusions. Multiple randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses have supported its effectiveness for PTSD. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, has been extensively studied, particularly with children and adolescents, combining cognitive restructuring with gradual, supported exposure to traumatic material. Internal Family Systems Therapy, IFS, developed by Richard Schwartz in the 1980s, offers a framework in which the mind is understood as composed of many different parts, each carrying its own feelings, memories, and roles. In the context of early trauma, this framework allows survivors to approach the most painful parts of their inner experience, including those holding shame, rage, or terror, with curiosity and compassion rather than avoidance or self-attack. Somatic approaches, therapies that work directly with the body's sensations and movement patterns, have also gathered significant clinical attention. Peter Levine, whose work on somatics, experiencing, was presented in his 1997 book, Waking the Tiger, proposed that trauma is, at its core, a biological incompletion. Survival responses, the mobilization of the body to fight or flee, are activated but not completed in traumatic situations where the person is unable to act. Gentle, titrated attention to body sensation in a safe context can, Levine argues, allow these physiological cycles to complete, and the nervous system to discharge its held activation and return to a more regulated baseline. Beyond formal therapy, the research on resilience, the capacity to adapt and recover in the face of adversity, points consistently to something elegant in its simplicity. Ann Maston of the University of Minnesota, one of the leading researchers in this field, has called resilience ordinary magic. Not a rare or exotic trait belonging to especially strong or special people, but a natural human capacity that is supported or undermined by the conditions of a person's life. And among the most powerful conditions supporting resilience, both in childhood and in adult healing, is the presence of at least one genuinely responsive, caring relationship. Not a perfect one, not a problem-free one, just one, which is, perhaps, its own kind of reveal. After all the neuroscience and all the research, the answer keeps pointing back to connection, to being seen, to having someone who says, without conditions, I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and you are not too much for me. We've traveled a long way tonight, from a weight loss clinic in California, where a discovery began, through the architecture of the developing brain, into the language of the body's survival responses, through the wordless grammar of our earliest relationships, and into the possibility, documented, studied, witnessed, of the path toward healing. If something tonight felt familiar, if some thread of recognition moved through you while you listened, that recognition belongs to you. However you arrived at this moment, with whatever history you carry, there is no judgment in this space. Only an acknowledgement that human beings are shaped by what they live through, and that understanding that shaping is the beginning of choosing what comes next. The brain that learned to be vigilant was doing its job. The nervous system that learned to stay ready was following its instructions. The self that found ways to survive a difficult beginning was ingenious, not broken. Healing doesn't require becoming a different person. Research suggests it looks more like recovering access to the fullness of the person you already are. Beneath the patterns, beneath the strategies and the armoring, there is something that the adversity never reached. Something that waited, that is still waiting. Understanding is the beginning, a quiet, unhurried, very real beginning. And in a world that so often asks us to have already healed, to perform wellness, to move on, there is something genuinely radical in simply slowing down enough to say, I want to understand what happened to me. I want to know myself with more kindness than I was shown. That too is a form of healing, one of the most important ones. Let your breath soften. Let the weight of the day dissolve a little further into the surface that holds you. You are allowed to rest here without earning it. If this kind of exploration speaks to you, a quiet like and subscribe goes a long way toward helping these conversations reach the people who need them most. Until next time, rest well.